Will rich countries lift their waivers on patents for Covid-19 vaccines? Leaders of poorer countries say that's needed to secure vaccines for their people. But many in the West argue intellectual property should be protected. So where does this wrangling leave millions still queuing to get a jab? This is Inside Story. Hi there, welcome to the programme. I'm Kim Vinell. Poor nations are stepping up their fight for equal access to Covid-19 vaccines. They're trying to convince rich nations to support their request for a waiver on patent rights. They say acquiring vaccine knowledge could help them boost production of jabs. US President Joe Biden must now decide whether to change course and support the move. The US is one of several nations resisting the request at the World Trade Body, arguing it would discourage innovation. Separately, the country is about to get control of a patent, basically making it the owner of the technology at the heart of several vaccines. Those vaccines are built on this technology, so producers will have to get licenses from the US to use it once the patent is issued. But will the US use the opportunity to pressure drug makers for more equal access? Rights campaigners warn the prospect of billions of people not being vaccinated for years to come could undermine the fight against the pandemic globally. They say 9 out of 10 people in poor countries may not get vaccinated at all this year. Only 0.1% of doses worldwide have been administered in the 50 poorest nations. Africa has been allocated 300 million doses so far for its population of more than 1.3 billion people. Also, more than half of the doses bought have been allocated to about 16% of the global population. Wealthy and middle-income countries have received about 90% of more than 440 million vaccines delivered so far. Let's bring in our guests. In New Haven, Thomas Pogge is Professor of Philosophy and Political Science at Yale University and co-founder of Incentives for Global Health. In Oxford, Samantha Vanderslot is researcher at the Oxford Vaccine Group, working on collective responsibility for infectious disease. In London, Max Lawson is head of inequality policy at Oxfam International. Very warm welcome to the programme. Thank you for joining us here on Inside Story. I'd like to begin with you, Samantha. America, as we've been saying, is about to receive control of a patent of basically the technology which is at the heart of several coronavirus vaccines. Can you explain that for us and what it might mean?
So I think we have already lost some opportunities to apply pressure on pharma companies to have open licensing. We know that already, but there is a chance that the governments like the US can now apply pressure to have more transfer of technology through their ownership of things like this patent.
So this patent is, I guess, molecular engineering. This has been described as the last best chance that we have for equitable access. What do you think, Thomas Pogge? Do you think this is the world's last best chance? Do you think that the world will take it? Will the US use this opportunity to pressure the drug makers?
Well, I don't think it's the only chance that we have. The key objectives are two. We have to increase production and we have to also equalize the access to the vaccines that are being produced. And this can only be achieved if we really bring on board all the production capacity that we have, including production capacity in the developing countries. And that, in turn, can be done in several ways. It can be done by trying to open up the IP and, importantly, also the knowledge and all the ingredients for vaccine production. And it can also be done if the pharmaceutical innovators hire that, rent out basically this production capacity, but they will only do that and rev up production if they are given incentives to produce in larger quantities. Mm-hmm. The problem is we have large poor populations in the world that do not produce meaningful market demand for vaccine. And we have to somehow translate their urgent need to be vaccinated into effective market demand.
OK. Max Dawson, I'd like to bring you in. Everyone seems to be talking about international collaboration, about equitable access to vaccines. It's all the talk, but it doesn't seem many are walking the walk. Why is that?
I think rich country leaders are quite rightly concerned about their own populations, and they're trying to cover up with a lot of fine talk about the COVAX mechanism and distributing vaccines equitably. And these things are good. I mean, they are making a difference. But the fact is that the vast majority of vaccines have been bought by rich countries for a very high price from pharmaceutical corporations who are making an enormous amount of money from vaccines that were publicly funded. These are public property being translated into private profit. We've seen in the last few weeks the profit predictions for companies like Pfizer, for Moderna, billions and billions of dollars being made producing these vaccines and selling them almost entirely to rich countries. This is a broken system. The market is not delivering, and we're seeing already the taste the EU is getting of their own medicine, with significant shortages in the EU of vaccines, fights between the EU and other nations, leaders in the EU meeting tomorrow and the next day to discuss this. What they should be doing, instead of fighting each other, they should be smashing down the doors of the pharmaceutical corporations and getting those recipes, which are public property, and then we can mass produce these vaccines for the world. We can have a people's vaccine instead of a profit vaccine. The moral case is so clear, and we need to see them act.
Max, you're saying that the governments could be lobbying or putting pressure on the drug companies. Is that not just passing the buck in some way? Couldn't governments just be putting forward the money that's necessary to vaccinate not just their populations, but poorer nations as well?
I think it's if you look at the prices being paid, I'll give you an example. So there are vaccines for tetanus and diphtheria that are produced and regularly given in the developing world at 9 cents a dose. Moderna is charging $15 a dose. So if rich countries only put forward more money to pay those kinds of prices, then the cost of vaccinating the world is astronomical and completely unnecessary. So the key point is, yes, rich countries should be funding the vaccination of the world, but the primary thing they could do is to open up production, because that will drive down prices. It will make vaccines much, much more affordable, which is, of course, much more sustainable in the long run. If we're going to have to consistently fight this disease for many years to come, we have to have vaccines that are cheap, effective, safe, and available in every nation on earth. So if I get coronavirus in Kenya, I'm as safe as I am here in London.
Samantha van der Slot, India, South Africa and some 55 other countries, as we're saying, have gone to the World Trade Organization to argue for access to COVID-19 patents. What are the chances of, so far, none of the big heavy hitters have agreed to it. What are the chances, do you think, that this will ever work?
So the richer countries are blocking this move, and it isn't looking likely that that's going to change at a WTO level. What I do see is this scenario that access will be opened up, but it's a question of how quickly this can happen. So if we look at antiretrovirals for HIV/AIDS, we don't want to be in a situation where access to those kind of drugs take decades, really, and years. I am very hopeful that COVID-19 vaccines will become more widely available, but it's the speed that we really need to be putting pressure on.
OK, I just want to pick up on that. If speed is the issue, we have these vaccines that are already in place, but if speed is the issue, is there a danger that if we don't get the vaccine out fast enough to enough people, it'll just mutate and actually these vaccines may not be as efficacious anymore?
Oh, definitely. This is the major worry, that a slow rollout will encourage more variants. And so vaccines will not work anymore. And we'll have to be looking at new boosters and new vaccines. So we don't want to have this endless cycle.
It's incredible, really, that, the fate of humanity is at play here, and yet the world can't seem to agree on getting this vaccine to everyone. Thomas Pogge, the countries that are blocking the WTO proposal for patent access, the ones that are blocking it say that it will impact innovation. If they were to open up the patents to everyone, it would impact the ability to innovate. Do they have a point?
They may well have a point that it will reduce incentives in the next pandemic. That is certainly a concern. But it doesn't take away from the moral imperative that is at place here. The rich countries, if they really insist on blocking IP and if they think they have a good argument for that, they have to find another way to solve the problem, right? We absolutely, for the reasons that you've given, we have to vaccinate the world as fast as we possibly can. One way of doing that is to do this technology transfer, TRIPS waiver, whatever the poor countries have demanded. But another way of doing that, if the rich countries absolutely do not want to do that, is to offer a fixed price per dose of vaccine and then buy the number of vaccines that you need for immunizing the world. Here you would set a ceiling, something like maybe $15, as Max just suggested. But even that, the cost is not really astronomical. The cost for 4 billion doses at $15 is $60 billion. And the United States alone has just passed a stimulus package of $1,900 billion. So really, the vaccine cost is a rounding error compared to the damage that this pandemic is doing worldwide.
And also, if we are talking about cost, Max Lawson, the Vatican, which has observer status at the World Trade Organization, has made the economic argument that any loss of profit to the drug companies, if they were to make the patents available, would be easily offset by the economic bounce back were the entire world vaccinated and everyone could return to work and production lines would be working again. Does that argument not hold any weight with the heavy hitters, the likes of the US or the UK?
I think it is. I think at least privately behind the scenes, the airlines, the industries with big supply chains in the developing countries, they will all be lobbying hard, the Biden administration and others, to say, look, why are you putting the profits of this one industry, the pharmaceutical industry, ahead of the economic recovery that will drive jobs, not just in developing countries, but in the US? So the numbers are staggering. The cost of not vaccinating the world is estimated to be about $9 trillion, which would translate into over $1 trillion for the US economy. So to be really clear with viewers, that means even if the US economy, every single adult in the US is vaccinated, they will still face that economic loss because of the trading implications. So ironically, given we're talking about the WTO, the strongest arguments against patents at the WTO are actually trade arguments in favor of the rest of the economy. So it is a no-brainer financially, but I wouldn't want to underestimate the cost of these vaccines for poor countries at the moment. What is a tiny amount of money for the French government per citizen is a huge amount for a government like the government of Uganda, where they're spending more buying vaccines themselves and getting into further debt than they currently spend on health for the entire year. So they're priced way beyond the means of almost every nation on earth at the moment because of these monopolies.
You raise a really good point. I want to come back to you, Samantha van der Sloot. Getting these vaccines out to poorer nations, even when the vaccines do get there, for example, the COVAX, the first shipment of COVAX, that's the Global Vaccine Alliance, those vaccines have gone to Ghana. But now they're having trouble getting it into people's arms because people there don't trust the vaccine. And even today, we've had Oxford, AstraZeneca, we've had questions come out around that vaccine, around the data, perhaps that it may have been using outdated information from its trials, giving an incomplete view. Although everyone still says this vaccine is safe, even that discussion, even that narrative impacts the way that people see these vaccines. So are we missing the wood for the trees? Are we talking too much about getting vaccines to everyone and not enough about making sure people want them?
This certainly has to be part of it. And we've just learned from past mistakes time and time again with vaccine campaigns that you have to bring the public on board. You have to give very clear communication, engage with communities. Otherwise, it just won't work. And we're already seeing that on many fronts. I think it can't just be about the vaccine and the technology itself. It's about the adoption, also what kind of implementation systems have you got in place. And I think also to add to the point that Thomas was making about access and also manufacturing being part and parcel of this issue, we can take smaller steps now that don't require WTO amendments and agreements. So, for example, encouraging pharma companies to collaborate with each other, as we've seen with Pfizer and Sanofi joining forces. And then also on the access front, the donations that are coming from richer countries, they're at the moment part of surplus vaccines, and we can encourage countries to be committing to a proportion of the vaccines that they're signing up to, rather than just giving away a surplus.
Talking about giving vaccines away, that raises the whole issue of vaccine diplomacy. Thomas Pogge, several countries are offering up doses to poorer countries. I'm thinking of China, I'm thinking of Russia. I mean, does that have any negative consequences? There's that old saying, nothing comes for free. So is this something that those countries might be paying for down the line?
Yeah, they may very well be having to pay for this down the line. This is obviously, in some cases, not very well motivated. But again, in some cases, there is also an altruistic motivation involved as well, where a country is trying to practice solidarity among the developing world. So I wouldn't say that all these efforts are automatically geopolitically motivated by power play and trying to make friends in the developing world. So it's a mixture of both motivations. And it's certainly, in some cases, more than one can say for the Western countries, who have done very little to help overcome these vaccine shortages in the poorer countries.
Max Lawson, how much money are drug companies actually making out of the coronavirus pandemic?
Let's take one, Pfizer. They estimate they're going to make $15 billion of revenue this year alone. This is going to become their biggest selling product. So they're going to make an enormous amount of money. Moderna, too, are making a huge amount of money. Not every company. AstraZeneca have said they're not going to make a profit during the pandemic. And also Johnson & Johnson are not charging as high a price, but they are all going to make a lot of money from this. And their shareholders, we're going to see the shareholder meetings in the next month. You'll see enormous payouts of billions of dollars to shareholders. For vaccines, let's not forget that we're funded by public money. These are publicly owned property, and we're handing this over to a profit-making industry. And I think it's very clear that we can see from the widespread shortages that no one company, even AstraZeneca, which has done some good deals all over the developing world, no one company is up to the job. You know, they're not up to the job of vaccinating the world. And also, I think we need to think at this from a kind of security perspective. Do we want the lives of humanity, the choice over who lives and who dies, to be a choice made by someone in an office in a pharmaceutical company, or do we want that to be made by governments together? And at the moment, the CEO of Pfizer gets to decide who lives and who dies around the world. That's not sustainable in the long run. And we've even seen commentators like Tony Blair come out recently saying that this is a classic example of market failure, and that we need to invest in domestic manufacturing in developing countries all over the world. So we have the government-owned, government-controlled ability to produce vaccines rapidly. We have these amazing new technologies. That's one of the big success stories with the mRNA vaccines. They enable vaccines to be produced much, much more rapidly in the future. Let's invest in a strategic global system for keeping us safe instead of relying on a broken system that puts profits that up until now have put more money into researching Viagra than malaria. These are not companies that we should put faith in terms of human safety and security.
I hear what you're saying. I wonder if we have missed the bus. You're talking about, governments invested a lot of money in getting these vaccines developed. We all remember, all of the announcements about the amounts of money that were going into these programs. Samantha van der Slot, couldn't governments have put contractual caveats into those deals at the time when they were putting money into these drug companies which were doing the development? Have we already missed the bus on that?
So it could have been possible at the time. I think under the conditions, this is not something that the governments ended up doing. I think under the pressure to change the pharmaceutical system was probably too much of a task. But it doesn't mean that things can't be done from now on. I don't think we missed the boat completely.
Thomas Pogge, should we be questioning the extent of control that patent holders for COVID-19 vaccines have?
Well, I think what we should first and foremost question is the system that gives these companies patents in the first place. Rewarding pharmaceutical innovation through monopoly patents is just not a very good way of doing it. First of all,
what's the alternative?
Scarcity of supply. Well, the alternative is what I've been proposing for many years, that you offer pharmaceutical companies rewards that are based on the health impact of any new pharmaceutical that they put on the market. So here it doesn't matter whether the patients are rich or poor, you get the same reward for the same amount of health impact. And if you had that sort of a system, you would obviously, it would be very lucrative to vaccinate the whole world, including the poorest. And that's what we urgently need to achieve if we really want to get rid of this pandemic before, as you said earlier, it breeds new mutations.
Almost like when you go into a new job and you have to sit down with your boss and create some goals to achieve. So if you did that with the drug companies at the start and make it based on their health outcomes, then they're going to have the incentive to go out there and make people healthy. Max Lawson, so that is a completely different system. That's an idea of a completely different system. Before we move on from the concept, not the concept, but move on from patents, from COVID vaccine patents, what impact would undermining these patents or giving free access to these patents, what impact would that have on future research, do you think?
Oh, I think we already have a broken system. So we could question the validity of the system as a whole. But even if we see this as an exceptional moment, and this is a once in a century human experience. So as the head of the WHO has said about this issue, if not now, when? I mean, we suspended patents for HIV/AIDS. That didn't destroy the patent system, but it kept many, many people alive. Myself, I would like to see wider reform of the patent system. I agree with Thomas. It is a system that rewards investment in Viagra over malaria. It's a system that has been broken for many, many, many years. So I think that remains true. But even if you don't accept that, you have to accept that this is an extraordinary moment in human history. And it seems absolutely crazy when these were publicly funded, that rich countries are willing to stand up there at the WTO and say, we are happily vaccinating all of our population. By the way, you can't vaccinate yours because innovation must be protected in the long run. I think it's absolutely morally unsustainable. But I think we also have to remember these leaders are self-interested. They are driven by their citizens. And it's not just the fact that within months, my mother had a vaccine 2-3 weeks ago here in the UK. I feel that the safety, the security, the freedom from fear that vaccine brings, it will only be a few months before someone like my mother get sick again from COVID-19 because the vaccine no longer works.
I understand. We are going to have to leave it there for time. My apologies, Max Lawson there from Oxfam International. We appreciate all of you joining us here on Inside Story. A big thank you too for watching. There we had Samantha van der Slot, researcher at Oxford Vaccine Group, Thomas Pogge, Professor of Philosophy, and of course Max Lawson, Oxfam International. Now, you can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Kim Vinell, and from the whole team here. Bye-bye for now.